All right. So before we dive into the Mongols, I want to talk about some other important pastoral groups from throughout the history of the world, kind of up to this time point. Because once we get past the Mongols, unfortunately, we're really not going to talk that much about pastoral peoples. Um, After, what the book calls the Mongol moment on the world stage, pastoral peoples generally get pushed, back into their fringe role in the big picture of world history. So I want to make sure that we know some of the main, most important pastoral groups, their contributions, and where they fit into, kind of the story of the world here. One of the first and most important is the Xiongnu. This is the Xiongnu are not one people. They are a compilation, no, not a compilation, that's a bad word, an alliance of militaristic nomadic tribes from what's known as the steppes and the deserts of Mongolia, of Central Asia, of southern Siberia. The Mongols themselves are part of this Xiongnu alliance that's created, in the early centuries, or not the early centuries, the late centuries BCE and the early centuries CE. And again, these are pastoral nomadic people. They generally, for the most part, raise horses and goats. Um, and they create this massive kind of tribal military alliance that was able to, at some points, only harass and raid. At other points in history, they were able to stand toe to toe with the Han Dynasty in China and halt the Han's expansion further north, which necessitated the creation of the Great Wall. So their place in history is pretty much documented permanently by the fact that there is a Great Wall in China. Um, One of the other really important pastoral peoples that we're going to actually talk more about as we get deeper into this class are the Turks. We've already talked about the Turks to a certain degree. We're going to talk about them more over the next two chapters. These are nomadic people from the grasslands of Central Asia and southern Russia. They're going to play a really big role going forward, especially in the Islamic world. Um, with the destruction of the Islamic Caliphate, which we're going to talk about here under the Mongols, the control of the Arab people over kind of the direction of Islam is broken. The Abbasid Caliphate is smashed. The Caliph is put to death by the Mongols, and this creates kind of a power vacuum within the Islamic world. And the Turks and the Persians, who had been kind of ethnic minorities within Islam, step forward and kind of become the new ruling majority in the Islamic world. And the Arab ethnicity is forced to kind of take a back seat in terms of controlling the direction of the religion going forward. Um, a lot of these different Turkic tribes also settle down and, become agrarian. Probably the most famous and the most well known are going to be the Ottoman Turks. These are going to be a group of Turks from southern Russia and Anatolia who start out as mercenaries and slaves within the Abbasid Caliphate, but eventually overthrow the Abbasids and found what's known as the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. And when we get to the gunpowder empires in two chapters, they're going to be one of the most significant. Another group that we haven't really talked about up to this point is a group known as the Maasai. Now, the Maasai are pastoralists from East and South Africa. These are ethnically Bantu people. They tend to raise cattle. Um, they are actually kind of an interesting kind of case study in pastoralism because these are a group of people that started out as an agrarian society and actually gave up that lifestyle to become pastoral over several centuries. Just kind of their cultural and their world outlook um, and their religious views kind of taught them to kind of simplify their lifestyle, to do away with all of the, kind of necessities of settled agricultural life, the government, the politics, the wealth, the cities. These guys would probably be big fans of Taoism, because their lifestyle generally, progresses back towards a simpler existence with less of the civilization and society. Now, the Maasai become really important um, as the Indian Ocean network expands. They have a very close relationship with why is the word escaping me? The East African city states, Swahili. There you go. That's the word. They have a very close relationship with the Swahili city states along the East African coast, and they help to support those East African city states through their migratory patterns because they move from the coast to the interior seasonally. So as they travel, they bring goods from the interior of Africa, mainly gold from Great Zimbabwe and slaves from the interior to these East African trading cities so that they can be purchased and then filtered out into the Indian Ocean network. Now, there's one other really important pastoral group that the book talks about that I didn't put on the slides here because we've talked about them um, in pretty solid detail so far, and that is obviously the Arabs. The Arabs start out as a pastoral people on the Arab Peninsula. They are the first to domesticate the camel and invent the camel saddle. They play a really big role in the Indian Ocean trade, especially when it comes to the buying and selling of incense and perfume. They deal heavily with the Romans and the Persians. Um, but we've talked about them mainly, obviously, as the founders of Islam and the story of Muhammad and then the Arab expansion from there. So, no need to go into a huge amount of detail again. Now, let's talk Mongols, right? Specifically, let's talk one Mongol, the Mongol. I won't say the only Mongol that matters, but the only Mongol that matters. And that is Chinggis or Genghis Khan, right? Now, most people don't realize this. Genghis Khan's name is not Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's name is actually Temujin. And Temujin's early life is not hugely prolific. There's nothing about his early days that to suggest that he's going to go on and become, one of the greatest conquerors in human history, but he does. Um, Mainly through a combination of his own ability and his own kind of innovative methods. So Temujin grows up in kind of a disgraced family. His father is killed by rivals very early on. His family loses all of their livestock, which, as you might imagine, among a pastoral people, is basically like the worst possible thing that can happen to you. But Temujin rebuilds his life. He recruits allies. He recruits men that are loyal to him. He promotes them based on their ability and on merit rather than their family ties, which is one of the things that's going to serve him very well. And over the years, he wins numerous battles, which brings more followers and more people into his tribe and into his clan. And finally, in 1206, at a very interesting ceremony known as a Kurotai, in which basically the Mongols elect their new leader by trampling as much grass as they can with their horses to signify who they want to be in charge. Mongols are very interesting people. You should read more on the Kurotai. Basically, Temujin is named Great King or Grand King, which in Mongolian is Chinggis Khan in 1206. Now, generally in this class, we try to avoid what's known as great man history, where, in the past, a lot of history is told as a story of just single great leaders accomplishing great things because they're great. Um, and that tends to make for a really good narrative. And a lot of people like to teach history that way because, it's all names and dates and events. And George Washington did this, and Napoleon Bonaparte did that, and Joseph Stalin this, and yada, yada, yada. And those things are really easy to memorize, and they're really easy to put on multiple choice tests. But that is not generally how history works. Generally, history is made by millions of unnamed people who you never get to know just doing everyday things. However, in this unit, we get to talk some great man history because, for the most part, Khan creates what we know as the Mongols. Um, Not really because he had any kind of like special premonition. He wasn't, there was no revelation from God telling him to go and conquer the whole world. But essentially, he had to. He mobilized the Mongol army against his neighbors mainly because he needed land and he needed loot to maintain his position and to provide for his followers. If you remember 2 slides ago when we talked about traits of pastoral people, land is necessary. Pastoral animals require a lot of grazing, and the more followers you have, the more land you require. The easiest way to get it is to go take it from someone else. And so that's what Khan does. Now, there's a really interesting comparison here. And if you get an SAQ or an LEQ asking you to compare the Mongols to another civilization or another time period or something along those lines, a really good comparison here would be between the Mongols and the Romans, because the Mongol economic model is really similar to the Roman economic model, in which the army drives the economy. Economic and political decisions are carried out through conquest. In order to continue to build and empower his people and his army and to maintain his position, Khan needs to keep conquering. He needs to keep adding land. And every time he adds land, he adds more followers. Hence, he needs more land. So, sorry about that. I'm trying to do this while I'm sick. So essentially, what you see is this kind of vicious cycle. And this is very similar to what we saw with the Romans, where the Roman legion was constantly on the march to provide more land, because that land would provide loot and treasure and natural resources, which would then go back in to feed the Roman Empire and the Roman war machine, and the cycle continues. So if you get hit with an LEQ or an SAQ where you need to compare the Romans or you need to compare the Mongols to someone else, those two are a pretty good comparison. Maybe not culturally, but in terms of their military and their economic model and how they fuel their empire, great match. Anyway, so getting back to the great man, Chinggis, Khan mobilizes the Mongol army first against northern China and then against enemies in Central Asia. And basically, over the next, let's see, 80 years or so, yeah, 80, maybe a little bit closer to 100, But over about the next 80 years, Khan and his descendants, his son Ogadai, his grandson Monke, and his grandson Kublai, they basically lay waste to all of Eurasia. Okay. The conquest of China takes the longest, but by 1279, they finally overthrow the Sung dynasty in southern China, basically gain control over all of China. They rampage through Central Asia. They lay waste to numerous very famous trading cities the along the Silk Road: Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur. All of these famous Silk Road cities, the Mongols just flatten them, raze them to the ground. Um, from there, they continue their conquest into Persia and into the Middle East. And in 1258, one of Monke's generals, Hulagu, who I believe is a nephew of Khan, Hulagu captures Baghdad and crushes the Abbasid Caliphate once and for all. They from there move north into Russia and into Eastern Europe. And there's a lot of debate about this, but I mean, the Mongols could have very well just continued. I mean, their conquests into Eastern Europe, basically, I mean, they don't go unopposed, but I mean, they win battle after battle with very few losses against the major armies of Europe. They crush the Poles, they crush the Russian city states, they absolutely massacre the Hungarians and the Bulgarians. Basically, the only thing that would have been standing in their way at that point would have been the Holy Roman Empire, which is, kind of like the remnants, what's left of Charlemagne and France. And, for the most part, based on how they fared against the Eastern European armies, I mean, those probably would have been no contest. But we will never know that because in 1238, right as the Mongol armies are poised to capture Vienna and move themselves into Western Europe, um, Ogadai dies, and in Mongol tradition, when the Khan dies, basically everybody drops everything, goes back to Mongolia so that they can hold the Kurotai and elect a new Khan. And because of the delay and because of the infighting about who would be the next Khan, basically the conquest of Eastern Europe and Western Europe is abandoned. Um, there's actually a really interesting article for those of you that want to go a little bit deeper. There's a series of books by a pretty prominent historian named Robert Crowley. And the series of books is called What If? And essentially, what it is, it's like alternate history. So Crowley rounds up all of these famous historians from all over the world, and he kind of throws them topics and is like, hey, what if XYZ thing had happened differently? And there's a really, really good article. I can't remember the author's name, but if you go on Amazon or whatever, look up the book What If. I mean, it'll pop up pretty much immediately. It's a pretty good selling title. But there's a really excellent article. I think it's what is it called? I think it's called "What If the Summer Hadn't Been So Rainy," and it talks about the Mongols smashing their way through Eastern Europe, and it addresses the what if Ogadai lives 2 more years, right? What if he doesn't die at that exact point, and the Mongols do smash their way through Western Europe, reduce, Western Europe, France, Germany, and all these other places to basically just Mongol vassal states. And it's a really interesting look because that has super long term effects. Like if that happens, do you get Christopher Columbus in 1492? Do you get a Renaissance? Do you get a Protestant Reformation? Do you get a scientific revolution? Do you get Isaac Newton and all of the things that are going to very rapidly start happening in Europe? Um, and the article addresses that, and it's a cool kind of alternate counterfactual idea of history. So if you're interested, I recommend reading it because it's really, really good. Those books in general are just really, really good. And they're, if you like history, it's just fun stuff to think about, right? So basically, over this 80-year span under Khan and his descendants, what you get is the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And the Mongols leave somewhere between 20 to 60 million people dead in their wake, right? So at its greatest point, which is, as the map says here, roughly around 1294. This is what the Mongol Empire looks like. Okay, it stretches from Korea and Siberia all the way in Asia, right up to the edge of Western Europe. This is twice the size of any other empire that's been built in human history. More than double the size of the Romans, more than double the size of Alexander, more than double the size of the Persians. I mean, this is a genuinely remarkable feat, um, especially when you consider that the majority of this conquest is undertaken by illiterate nomads on horseback with very little in the way of what you would consider modern technology for the time. Now, they do adopt technology from the Chinese, from the Persians, as they conquer cities, but that is not generally their forte. The Mongols are horse archers. They are cavalry soldiers. They fight, sleep, and basically live on the backs of their horses. So to build this kind of empire with no real experience in siege technology, with no real experience in building catapults or gunpowder weapons, bombs and rockets, to put together an empire like this in an 80-year period, I mean, it's basically unheard of in all of human history, which is again why the Mongols are the exception.